Money FM 89.3. Best of breakfast. The bigger picture only on Money FM 89.3.
Thanks for joining us on Money FM 89.3. I'm Huang. Now, according to a study, Singapore-listed companies are not doing nearly enough when it comes to whistleblowing policies. For example, less than half of mainboard-listed issuers say that all whistleblowing complaints are even reviewed, and most did not specify how they would safeguard whistleblowers' identities. So for more insights, we check in with Professor Mak Yuen Teen. He is the Director of Center for Investor Protection at NUS Business School, which came up with the study. He's also the Professor of Accounting at the school. Good morning, Prof. Mak. How are you doing today?
Good morning, Ryan. I'm doing well.
Yeah, corporate governance really under spotlight these days. How much was a surprise this was when it comes to the findings?
Well, not a surprise at all, because based on my own review of companies and looking at companies that have been in trouble, and you always ask the question in terms of why these things didn't come out a little bit earlier, right? Think about companies that have been involved in bribery scandals, for example, for many years. And you kind of have to ask why were they not escalated, right? So I think there was always a sense that there are big gaps in terms of whistleblowing policies. I think this study bears it out.
Yeah, walk us through some of the numbers. What sparked you to commission this study, and walk us through also the methodology behind it?
Yeah, I've always been interested in whistleblowing policies. In fact, about 20 years ago, I've been already saying that we should have better protection for whistleblowers. But I decided, SGX has introduced rules on whistleblowing policies back in 2022. They set up a whistleblowing office. So I thought it's timely to actually look at what companies are actually doing. The way we did this study was basically we looked at companies' disclosures of their whistleblowing policies in their latest annual reports and sustainability reports, and then we look at their corporate website. So to be clear, we are basically assessing what they say in terms of what they have in the policy, right? And I want to emphasize that even if they have it in the policy or they say it doesn't mean they are practicing it, right? But if they don't even say it, then the question is, are they even thinking about it? Okay, so that's kind of how we did the study, and it was quite a lot of work involved, obviously, in scrutinizing every company.
Yeah, and to your point, I'm just looking at some of the findings, and your study identified key gaps, raising concerns about whistleblowing policy effectiveness in ensuring good corporate governance. And this, of course, comes in the backdrop of many incidents in recent weeks. One of them, of course, CDL, and you have SingPost as well. Now, you've mentioned that some of these policies are poorly designed. What do you mean by that, and what needs to be fixed?
Yeah, poorly designed in the sense of, I think there are many elements, and what we try to do, for example, when we put together a whistleblowing scorecard, right, to do an overall assessment of where companies are at, we look at all these different areas. So let's start with when somebody blows the whistle, right? The first question would be, first of all, do you even acknowledge the whistleblowing complaint, right? Because especially if the whistleblower has identified himself or herself, I think it is just good practice to say, hey, we have received the complaint and we are looking into it. So that's the first step, right? And then secondly, do you accept anonymous complaints? Does your policy allow for that? And then once the complaint is received, do you have somebody independent looking at those complaints, reviewing the complaints? Okay, because you cannot just leave it to whoever receives the complaint. And whistleblowing complaints can be sent to many different channels, right? As we kind of said in the study, we're going to make sure that whoever receives the complaint, that's escalated to essentially to an independent board committee or to the board, right? We should then decide, given the evidence, should we pursue an investigation, okay? And then once you do that, then the next question is, who should lead the investigation, right? And who should be involved? Because you also need to make sure that it must be an independent function that is kind of doing the investigation. So there are many, many issues, and also issues like how do you then protect the whistleblower? How do you ensure that the whistleblower identity is not compromised? And so on, right? And how do you communicate the policy? So there are many, many things that are necessary for a good policy, for a policy to work.
So you have a 20-item scorecard with a maximum possible score of 40, and looking at the average score, we have 20.6, just barely scraping the break-even point. All right, let's unpack some of these names you've been studying. Of course, on the STI, the three banks have a huge weightage on the market. How was performance from these three?
First of all, none of them disclosed the number of whistleblowing complaints. I think these three banks are kind of probably slightly above the average, maybe, overall. The truth is there's only, say, an odd company. We see the highest score, right, is 36 in this study, right? And so this company will have a policy that, at least on paper, cover most of the areas. But I think it's fair to say that the banks, the companies in the STI, most of them have still significant room for improvement in terms of having a good whistleblowing policy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any companies stood out for you when it comes to best practices?
So in the report, we gave some examples of good practices. We didn't name the companies, but we gave examples of companies that took extra steps to protect the confidentiality of the whistleblower, to protect the whistleblowers against reprisals or detriment. But I guess if we look at a company like Syntel, right? Syntel actually has a lot of complaints, okay? But they disclosed it. And I think for a company like this, which is so big, right? Syntel is basically one of the biggest companies listed here. You would expect a certain number of complaints. So I think it's good to be upfront to say how many complaints you have. And the other thing we like about Syntel, and that's why we pull out some of the disclosures and included in the report, because they actually give a very detailed breakdown in terms of how many complaints they have in Syntel here versus Optus in Australia, and then kind of outside of Australia, they talk about how many were received, how many were substantiated, and then classified into different kinds of breaches. So to me, right, that's transparency for a company to acknowledge that they have a number of complaints. I mean, recently I was just talking to a multinational, U.S. multinational, and they were talking about in this region, kind of APAC, right? They kind of hand over complaints in a year, and they say they are comfortable with that because it kind of shows that the policy is working. And whereas many of the STI companies, basically many of them don't disclose the number of complaints, and then a number of them say zero complaints. And overall, if we look at the study, many companies say they have zero complaints, and I think if you have zero complaints over a whole year, you've got to ask whether your policy is really working.
Yeah, that's a very good point, right? Is zero really a healthy number when it comes to the number of complaints you're getting? Or conversely, is a higher number better? A lot of things to consider. And of course, you want a holistic picture. And like you pointed out, you want to make sure things are designed enough for people to step forward to share their thoughts. All right, let's take a look at some of the other names that have been making the headlines these days. We've been talking about CDL, SingPost as well for corporate governance question marks. Where do they stand on this list?
Well, SingPost, right? I mean, SingPost, obviously, there were some questions in terms of how they were disclosing, right? Initially, the investigations, but I think subsequently they released more information. So I think in SingPost's case, I mean, there will obviously be questions in terms of, first of all, when the complaints were received, right? We do not know whether the complaints are anonymous or not. We do not know whether they acknowledge the complaints, right? That's one thing we still do not know. But of course, one of the good things is they got the internal audit, right, to kind of take charge. But of course, I also did raise a question in terms of, because the internal audit is supposed to be independent, because it has direct reporting to the audit committee. Okay, so it actually met with the audit committee fairly quickly. But I think there will still be questions in terms of, do you have does the internal audit have the capabilities to do an investigation, right? Because investigation and internal audit is quite different. And then there will be questions in terms of, once you in this situation, I think the internal audit on the audit committee really have to take charge, right, to decide who should be involved in this investigation. Yes, internal audit maybe can lead it. Should we then include legal and compliance, right? But to what extent should we involve even top management, right? I think those are some issues that may have come out because there certainly in the SingPost case, there are certainly questions in terms of, was management at the early stage, the top management who were eventually terminated, were they too involved? Should they have been kept out more from the investigations at the initial stage, right? Because the disclosure seemed to suggest that perhaps they were involved a little bit more than they should be. And then that then raises the question of, would then that become a threat to the potential whistleblowers, right? If you have kind of the CEO eventually through being involved, knowing who might be the one, right, who blows the whistle. In the case of CDL, CDL obviously is one of the STI companies. We did look at the STI companies. I think they did say something about a number of incidents they have in MNC, which have been in the news, but they were not really specific in terms of how many complaints they received and whether those incidents that they mentioned, right, were a result of whistleblowing complaints. So basically, to us, right, CDL, I wouldn't say was transparent in terms of the disclosure either.
Well, definitely a lot of room for improvement as well as review for some of these whistleblowing policies. We have been in conversation with Prof. Mak Yuen Teen. He is the Director of Center for Investor Protection at NUS Business School with his new study. And we've been breaking down where Singapore-listed companies stand when it comes to the design as well as the effectiveness of some of their whistleblowing policies as part of his new study. Prof. Mak, thanks so much for your time today.
You're most welcome.
Before acting on the information on Money FM, please consider if it's suitable for your own investment objectives, financial situation, and risk tolerance. To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.